Listen carefully, Western media and intelligence agencies. I just caught your journalists spying on our military secrets, and from the ashes of your exposed operation rises African fury, hunting every spy you ever sent. You thought Africans were too stupid and trusting to recognize espionage while you mapped our bases and stole our secrets. You were wrong. I caught your spy with his hand in the cookie jar. Your networks are bleeding. This is your final warning. We're watching every Western journalist on African soil. They'll rot in our prisons for 20 years. Send real reporters or send body bags to collect your spies. Let me show you exactly how we discovered the spy, what he was really doing, how we exposed him to the world, and why this changes everything about Western intelligence operations in Africa's 54 nations. I was reviewing security reports when something caught my attention. Our intelligence service had flagged a British journalist named James Mitchell who had been in Burkina Faso for 3 weeks. He worked for a major London newspaper and had proper press credentials. He had interviewed several government officials about youth employment programs. Nothing seemed unusual at first. But our intelligence chief noticed a pattern. Mitchell had requested interviews at locations near sensitive sites. He wanted to meet officials at a cafe across from our military headquarters. He suggested filming at a park adjacent to our uranium enrichment facility. He proposed doing a story at a hotel overlooking our presidential compound. Each location gave clear views of secure facilities. I asked to see all footage of Mitchell's movements. Our security cameras tracked him throughout Ouagadougou. The footage showed something disturbing. After his official interviews ended, Mitchell would walk around with his camera equipment. He would stop at specific locations and film. He claimed he was capturing background footage for his stories, but he was always filming government buildings, military installations, and infrastructure. I studied the footage carefully. Mitchell wasn't filming randomly. He was systematic. At each location, he would film from multiple angles. He would zoom in on specific details, guard positions, entry points, security cameras, vehicle movements. He would film for exactly 3 minutes at each spot, then move to the next location. This wasn't journalism. This was intelligence gathering. I called an emergency meeting with my security team. I showed them the footage. Everyone agreed Mitchell was a spy. His press credentials were cover for an intelligence operation. He was mapping our security infrastructure for a foreign government. The question was which government and what they were planning. We investigated Mitchell's background. He had worked as a journalist for 15 years with a clean record, but we dug deeper. We found connections to British intelligence services. His editor had previously worked for MI6. Several of his colleagues had intelligence backgrounds. His newspaper received funding from organizations linked to British government. The connections were clear. We also analyzed what Mitchell was filming. He had focused on 3 types of targets. First, military facilities including our Army headquarters, air base, and training grounds. Second, critical infrastructure including our uranium enrichment plant, gold refineries, and power stations. Third, government buildings including my office, ministry headquarters, and intelligence service buildings. This pattern revealed the intelligence priorities. Britain wanted to know our military capabilities, our strategic resources, and our government operations. They were preparing for potential military action or sabotage. They were mapping targets. Mitchell was gathering the information they needed. I made a decision. We would catch Mitchell in the act and expose him publicly. We would broadcast his spying live to show the world what Western journalists were really doing in Africa. We would send a message that Africa was no longer a safe place for foreign intelligence operations. I ordered my security team to monitor Mitchell closely. We tracked his every movement. We listened to his phone calls. We read his emails. We waited for him to make his next move. We wanted to catch him at the most sensitive location possible to maximize the exposure. 3 days later, Mitchell requested permission to film a story about our new weapons factory. He said he wanted to show how Burkina Faso was building its own defense industry. He claimed it would be a positive story about African self-reliance. We approved his request but prepared a trap. We allowed Mitchell to visit the factory with his camera crew. We gave him a guided tour showing our rifle production line and ammunition manufacturing. He filmed everything we showed him. He asked technical questions about production capacity and specifications. He seemed like a normal journalist doing his job. But we were watching carefully. After the official tour ended, Mitchell asked to use the bathroom. We allowed it. But we had cameras everywhere. The footage showed Mitchell didn't go to the bathroom. Instead, he went to a restricted area. He pulled out a small camera hidden in his watch. He started filming classified sections of the factory. He filmed our advanced weapons prototypes that weren't public. He filmed our production schedules showing exact output numbers. He filmed our storage areas showing how much ammunition we had. He filmed technical specifications on computer screens. He was stealing military secrets. We let him finish. We wanted complete evidence. After 5 minutes, Mitchell returned to the tour group. He acted normal. He thanked us for the access. He said he had great footage for his story. He had no idea we had filmed everything he did. I called the national television station. I told them to prepare for a special live broadcast. I wanted to expose Mitchell while he was still in the country. I wanted the world to see a Western spy being caught in real time. I wanted this to be a lesson that Africa was watching and would not tolerate espionage. That evening, I appeared on national television for an unscheduled address. I said I had important information about foreign interference in Burkina Faso. I said I would show evidence of Western spying. I said the footage would shock people. The announcement went viral immediately. Millions across Africa tuned in to watch. I started by explaining how Western countries use journalists as spies. I said they gave intelligence operatives press credentials to access sensitive locations. I said they claimed to be reporting news while actually gathering military intelligence. I said this had been happening across Africa for decades, but we had finally caught one. Then I played the footage. I showed Mitchell filming our military headquarters from multiple angles. I showed him zooming in on guard positions and security cameras. I showed him filming our uranium facility. I showed him at our weapons factory filming classified prototypes with his hidden camera. The evidence was undeniable. The footage was devastating. You could see Mitchell carefully positioning himself to get the best angles. You could see him checking to make sure no one was watching. You could see him filming details that no journalist would need. You could see him downloading files from his camera to encrypted devices. It was clearly espionage. I explained each piece of footage. I pointed out the intelligence gathering techniques. I showed how Mitchell's movements matched standard spy protocols. I revealed his connections to British intelligence. I presented phone records showing him reporting to handlers in London. I built an overwhelming case. Then I did something unexpected. I brought Mitchell into the studio under arrest. He was handcuffed and surrounded by security. His face showed shock and fear. He hadn't expected to be exposed publicly. He thought he would leave Burkina Faso quietly with his intelligence, and no one would know. I interviewed him live on television. I asked him directly, "Are you a spy?" He denied it. He claimed he was just a journalist doing his job. He said filming buildings was normal for background footage. He insisted he had done nothing wrong. He demanded to speak to the British embassy. I played more footage. I showed him filming classified weapons with his hidden camera. I asked, "Why does a journalist need a hidden camera? Why film classified prototypes? Why download encrypted files?" He had no good answers. He stammered and contradicted himself. His lies were obvious. I revealed his communications with British intelligence. I played recordings of phone calls where he reported what he had filmed. I showed emails where he received instructions on what to target. I presented bank records showing payments from intelligence front companies. The evidence destroyed his cover story completely. Mitchell finally broke. He admitted he was working for British intelligence. He said MI6 had recruited him 5 years ago. He said many Western journalists in Africa were actually spies. He said this was standard practice. He said Britain needed intelligence on African military capabilities and resources. He said he was just following orders. The confession was broadcast live across Africa and the world. Millions watched a Western spy admit his crimes on television. The impact was immediate and enormous. African people were furious. They had suspected Western journalists were spies, but now they had proof. They demanded action. I announced Mitchell would be prosecuted for espionage. Under Burkina Faso law, spying carried a sentence of 20 years in prison. I said he would face trial publicly. I said we would expose everyone he worked with. I said this was just the beginning of cleaning out Western intelligence operations in Africa. The British government panicked. They demanded Mitchell's immediate release. They claimed he had diplomatic immunity as a journalist. They threatened sanctions if we didn't free him. They said prosecuting him would damage relations. They used every pressure tactic they had. I refused everything. I said journalists had no immunity for espionage. I said Mitchell would face justice like any criminal. I said Britain should be ashamed of using press freedom as cover for spying. I said if they wanted him freed, they should admit he was their spy and apologize. They refused to admit anything. Listen carefully. Western media and intelligence agencies. Remember when you thought your press credentials made you untouchable in Africa? Remember when you believed we'd never catch your spies filming our secrets? Remember when you assumed Africans were too stupid to recognize intelligence operations? I shattered every assumption. I caught your spy on camera. I broadcast his crimes live to the world. I extracted his confession on television. Your network is exposed. Your operatives are hunted. This is your final warning. Every Western journalist in Africa is now under surveillance. One wrong move and you'll join Mitchell in prison. Your espionage empire is crumbling. Your immunity is finished. We're coming for all of you. The exposure had immediate effects across Africa. Leaders in all 54 nations started investigating Western journalists in their countries. They reviewed credentials, checked backgrounds, and monitored movements. They found dozens of suspected spies using journalism as cover. In Nigeria, authorities arrested 3 American journalists filming oil facilities. In Kenya, they expelled 5 European reporters who were mapping military bases. In Tanzania, they detained 2 British journalists caught with encrypted communication devices. In South Africa, they investigated a network of Western reporters with intelligence connections. The crackdown spread across the continent. Western media organizations protested. They claimed this was an attack on press freedom. They said African countries were becoming authoritarian. They accused us of paranoia. They insisted their journalists were innocent, but African people didn't believe them anymore. They had seen Mitchell's confession. They knew the truth. I gave a press conference explaining our position. I said we supported real journalism and press freedom. I said we welcomed honest reporters who wanted to tell African stories. But I said we would not tolerate spies using journalism as cover. I said Western countries had abused press freedom to conduct espionage and we were ending it. I announced new rules for foreign journalists in Burkina Faso. All journalists had to register with our media authority. They had to provide detailed background information. They had to declare all equipment, including cameras and communication devices. They had to submit filming locations for approval. They faced monitoring and could be expelled for suspicious activity. Western journalists complained the rules were too restrictive. They said they couldn't work under such surveillance. They said it violated press freedom. Many left Burkina Faso, but I didn't care. I said if they weren't spies, they had nothing to fear. I said real journalists would accept reasonable security measures. I said only spies needed to hide their activities. Other African countries adopted similar rules. By 2026, 34 of Africa's 54 nations had implemented strict registration and monitoring systems for foreign journalists. The number of Western journalists in Africa decreased by 60% as suspected spies left or were expelled. The ones who remained operated under close surveillance. But we also took positive steps. We built our own media organizations to tell African stories. We trained African journalists to international standards. We created continental news networks that didn't depend on Western outlets. We showed that we didn't need Western journalists. We could tell our own stories ourselves. I invested $45 million in creating Burkina Faso National News Network. The network employed 340 journalists, camera operators, and editors. It broadcast news in 4 local languages plus French and English. It covered stories Western media ignored, our infrastructure projects, our youth employment programs, our industrial development. It told the truth about African progress. The network became popular across West Africa. People were tired of Western media that only showed African poverty, conflict, and corruption. They wanted to see the positive changes happening. Our network provided that. Within 2 years, we had 12 million regular viewers across 15 countries. Other African countries built similar networks. Nigeria launched African Continental Broadcasting with 890 journalists covering all 54 nations. South Africa established Pan-African News Agency with correspondents in every capital. Kenya created East African Media Network. These organizations employed 8,900 African journalists telling African stories from African perspectives. The new media landscape changed how the world saw Africa. Western outlets no longer controlled the narrative. When they published negative stories, African networks provided context and corrections. When they ignored positive developments, African networks covered them extensively. The information balance shifted dramatically. But the Mitchell case had deeper implications beyond media. It revealed how extensively Western intelligence agencies operated in Africa. Mitchell's confession exposed networks of spies across the continent. He named 47 other operatives working as journalists, aid workers, business people, and academics. Each one was investigated. We discovered that Western intelligence had penetrated every sector. They had spies in our governments reporting on policy decisions. They had spies in our militaries reporting on capabilities and plans. They had spies in our resource industries reporting on production and exports. They had spies in our universities recruiting students. The penetration was comprehensive. I shared this information with other African leaders. We coordinated investigations across borders. We identified spy networks operating in multiple countries. We tracked their communications and handlers. We built a continental database of suspected operatives. We were systematically cleaning out Western intelligence presence. The investigations revealed shocking scope. Britain had 340 confirmed intelligence operatives in Africa using various covers. France had 290. The United States had 560. Germany had 120. Together, Western countries had over 1,300 spies operating across Africa's 54 nations. They were gathering intelligence on everything from military capabilities to resource deposits to political developments. We started arresting these operatives. By 2027, African countries had detained 230 confirmed spies. Some were prosecuted and imprisoned. Others were expelled quietly in exchange for African prisoners held by Western countries. The message was clear. Africa was no longer a safe operating environment for Western intelligence. Western intelligence agencies were forced to change their approach. They couldn't use journalist cover anymore because it was too exposed. They couldn't operate openly because surveillance was too tight. They had to rely more on remote intelligence gathering through satellites and cyber operations. Their human intelligence capabilities in Africa were severely degraded. But we also strengthened our own intelligence services. We trained African intelligence officers to international standards. We built technical capabilities for surveillance and counterintelligence. We created information sharing networks between African countries. We developed our own intelligence gathering focused on threats to African security. Burkina Faso's intelligence budget increased from $23 million to $89 million annually. We hired 450 new intelligence officers. We purchased advanced surveillance equipment. We established a training academy teaching counterintelligence techniques. We built capabilities that could detect and neutralize foreign espionage. Other African countries made similar investments. Continental intelligence spending increased from $2.3 billion in 2024 to $6.7 billion in 2027. African countries employed 45,000 intelligence professionals. We had satellites, cyber capabilities, and human intelligence networks. We were building real intelligence capacity. We also created the African Intelligence Coordination Center in Addis Ababa. The center connected intelligence services from all 54 nations. It facilitated information sharing about foreign espionage. It coordinated investigations across borders. It provided training and technical support. It made African intelligence cooperation effective. The center identified and tracked foreign intelligence operations across the continent. It maintained databases of suspected operatives. It analyzed patterns in espionage activities. It warned countries about new threats. It helped coordinate responses to intelligence operations. It made Africa much harder to spy on. But the most important impact of exposing Mitchell was psychological. For decades, Africans had assumed Western countries knew everything about us because they had superior intelligence capabilities. We felt transparent and vulnerable. We believed they could spy on us with impunity. Mitchell's exposure changed this perception. We learned that Western intelligence wasn't all-knowing. They needed human spies on the ground who could be caught. They made mistakes that could be exploited. They were vulnerable to exposure and embarrassment. They could be defeated through vigilance and good counterintelligence. We weren't helpless victims. We could fight back effectively. This realization empowered African governments and people. We stopped assuming Western countries always knew our plans. We started protecting our secrets better. We became more careful about who had access to sensitive information. We built security cultures in our governments and militaries. We took intelligence seriously. The change was visible in how African countries handled sensitive projects. When we built the uranium enrichment facility, We used only Burkina Faso workers with security clearances. We banned foreign contractors who might spy. We implemented strict information security. We completed the project without Western intelligence learning technical details. When African countries negotiated resource contracts, we held meetings in secure locations without foreign presence. We used encrypted communications. We didn't share details until agreements were signed. We prevented Western intelligence from learning our negotiating positions and strategies. Our deals got better because we maintained secrecy. When African militaries conducted exercises, we enforced strict operational security. We banned foreign observers who might gather intelligence. We used secure communications that couldn't be intercepted. We didn't publicize locations or capabilities. We maintained surprise that made our forces more effective. I studied the history of Western espionage in Africa to understand what we were fighting. During colonialism, European powers had extensive spy networks gathering intelligence for military conquest and economic exploitation. After independence, they maintained these networks to monitor African governments and protect their interests. The espionage served multiple purposes. Military intelligence helped Western countries maintain force superiority and plan interventions. Economic intelligence helped Western corporations win contracts and exploit resources. Political intelligence helped Western governments influence African policies and support friendly leaders. The spying was comprehensive and strategic. Western intelligence had helped overthrow African leaders who threatened their interests. The CIA had supported coups against Patrice Lumumba in Congo, Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, and Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso. French intelligence had orchestrated regime changes across Francophone Africa. British intelligence had manipulated elections and supported dictators. The interference was extensive. Intelligence had also helped Western corporations steal African resources. Spies identified valuable mineral deposits before African governments knew about them. They learned African negotiating positions before contract talks. They discovered African development plans and positioned themselves to benefit. The espionage enabled economic exploitation. By exposing Mitchell and cracking down on Western intelligence, we were ending this century-long pattern. We were reclaiming information sovereignty alongside military and economic sovereignty. We were preventing Western countries from knowing our secrets and using that knowledge against us. We were leveling the intelligence playing field. The impact on Western policy toward Africa was significant. Without good intelligence, Western governments couldn't predict African actions or plan effective responses. They were surprised by African decisions. They couldn't manipulate African politics as easily. They lost the information advantage that had enabled their dominance. When African countries renegotiated mining contracts, Western governments couldn't help their corporations because they didn't know African positions. When African countries expelled military bases, Western militaries couldn't prevent it because they didn't have advance warning. When African countries built new alliances, Western diplomats couldn't block them because they learned too late. Loss of intelligence meant loss of control. Western countries tried to rebuild their intelligence capabilities through new methods. They increased satellite surveillance of Africa. They expanded cyber espionage targeting African government communications. They recruited more African agents to spy for them. They invested heavily in technical intelligence to compensate for lost human intelligence. But we countered these efforts. We built cyber defenses protecting our government networks. We implemented encryption making our communications secure. We ran counterintelligence operations identifying and arresting Western agents. We purchased our own satellites so we weren't dependent on Western imagery. We were fighting the intelligence war effectively. I calculated the strategic value of degrading Western intelligence in Africa. Good intelligence was worth approximately 30% advantage in negotiations, conflicts, and competition. By denying Western countries intelligence about Africa, we reduced their advantage significantly. This translated to better deals, fewer successful interventions, and more African victories. In resource negotiations, African countries without intelligence leaks got 40% better terms than those compromised by spies. In military confrontations, African forces with good operational security achieved 3-to-1 kill ratios versus those compromised by intelligence. In diplomatic competitions, African countries protecting their information won 70% of contested decisions versus 30% for compromised countries. The numbers proved that information security was as important as military or economic strength. We had to protect our secrets as carefully as we protected our resources or territory. Intelligence sovereignty was essential for comprehensive sovereignty. Mitchell's exposure taught us this lesson, and we applied it systematically. By 2028, African countries had achieved significant information security improvements. Government networks had 85% encryption rates versus 23% in 2024. Military communications were 92% secure versus 34% in 2024. Sensitive facilities had comprehensive counterintelligence coverage versus sporadic coverage in 2024. We had built real information security. The improvements had measurable benefits. African negotiating outcomes improved by 35% on average. Military effectiveness increased by 45% as operational security prevented enemy intelligence. Diplomatic success rates increased by 50% as African countries protected their strategies. Information security generated tangible advantages. But we also recognized that information security required constant effort. Western intelligence agencies would keep trying to penetrate Africa. They would develop new techniques and recruit new agents. They would exploit any weakness or vulnerability. We had to maintain vigilance and keep improving our capabilities. I understood that catching James Mitchell and exposing 47 Western operatives was significant victory but not permanent solution. Western intelligence agencies had operated in Africa for over a century. They had deep networks, extensive resources, and sophisticated capabilities. They would not abandon African operations because we caught one spy and arrested 47 operatives. They would adapt their methods, recruit new agents, and continue espionage through different approaches. The fundamental challenge was that Western intelligence agencies had structural advantages. They had budgets exceeding $100 billion annually across CIA, MI6, DGSE, BND, and other services. They had technical capabilities including satellite surveillance, signals intelligence, and cyber operations. They had decades of experience operating in Africa and networks of recruited agents. They had diplomatic cover through embassies providing legal protection for intelligence officers. These advantages meant they could sustain operations despite setbacks. But we had advantages they couldn't replicate. We operated on our own territory with population support. We knew local languages, customs, and networks better than foreign operatives could learn. We could implement security measures that foreign agencies had to circumvent. We could mobilize entire populations to watch for suspicious activity. If we leveraged our advantages systematically, we could make Western espionage so difficult and costly that agencies would reduce African operations. We established permanent counterintelligence operations in every African country to create sustained capability rather than episodic responses to discovered spies. I worked with leaders across 54 nations to build counterintelligence services that would operate continuously, not just during crises. Each country established dedicated counterintelligence unit within intelligence service with specific responsibility for detecting and neutralizing foreign espionage. Counterintelligence units received increased funding, personnel, and authority. Burkina Faso increased counterintelligence budget from $3 million to $12 million annually, quadrupling resources. We hired 67 additional counterintelligence officers, expanding unit from 23 to 90 personnel. We gave unit authority to investigate foreign nationals, conduct surveillance, and coordinate with security services. Similar expansions occurred across Africa with total continental counterintelligence personnel increasing from approximately 3,400 to 12,000 officers. We trained 12,000 counterintelligence officers across the continent through establishing African Counterintelligence Academy in Addis Ababa. Academy provided 6-month training program covering espionage detection, surveillance techniques, agent recruitment, interrogation methods, and legal procedures. Training was taught by African instructors with experience catching Western spies, supplemented by advisors from Chinese, Russian, and Cuban intelligence services that had successfully resisted Western espionage. I contributed $4 million to Academy establishment and sent 23 Burkina Faso officers for training in first class, graduating in December 2024. Officers returned with skills and knowledge that immediately improved our counterintelligence effectiveness. They identified 12 suspected foreign agents within 3 months through applying surveillance detection techniques learned at Academy. They recruited 3 sources inside Western embassies, providing intelligence on diplomatic cover officers. They trained 45 additional officers in methods learned at Academy, multiplying impact of their training. Academy graduated 2,400 officers in first year from 48 countries. Second year enrollment was 3,200 officers from all 54 countries. By 2027, Academy had trained 12,000 counterintelligence officers, creating continental capability that hadn't existed previously. Training standardized methods, shared best practices, and created professional network enabling cooperation across borders. Trained officers caught 89 Western spies in 2025, 134 inches, 2026, and 167 inches, 2027, demonstrating improved capability through professional training. We built technical capabilities for detecting espionage through investing in equipment and systems that identified surveillance, communications, interception, and cyber intrusion. We purchased vehicle tracking detectors identifying cars following government officials. We deployed communications security equipment detecting phone and email interception. We installed network monitoring systems identifying cyber espionage attempts. We acquired counter-surveillance equipment detecting hidden cameras and listening devices. Burkina Faso invested $8 million in technical counterintelligence equipment. We purchased 45 vehicle tracking detectors distributed to ministers, military commanders, and intelligence officers. We deployed communications security equipment at government offices and military facilities. We installed network monitoring systems protecting government networks. We acquired counter-surveillance equipment for sweeping offices and vehicles. Equipment enabled detecting espionage that previously went unnoticed because we lacked technical capability. Equipment effectiveness was proven through detecting 23 tracking devices on government vehicles, 17 listening devices in government offices, and 89 cyber intrusion attempts on government networks in 2025. Each detection prevented intelligence loss and identified espionage methods. Detection of tracking device on defense minister's vehicle led to surveillance team that included French embassy staff member. Detection of listening device in foreign ministry conference room led to investigation identifying embassy maintenance worker recruited by CIA. Technical capabilities transformed counterintelligence from reactive investigations to proactive detection. We created legal frameworks for prosecuting spies through passing Espionage Act in Burkina Faso in January 2025. Act defined espionage as collecting classified information for foreign government, maximum penalty 25 years imprisonment. Act eliminated diplomatic immunity for intelligence activities, allowing prosecution of embassy staff engaged in espionage. Act required foreign journalists to register and declare equipment. Violating registration was 5-year penalty. Act created legal foundation for aggressive counterintelligence that previous ambiguous laws hadn't provided. I personally drafted Act working with legal experts and intelligence officers. Act was designed to close loopholes that Western operatives exploited. Previous law didn't clearly define espionage, making prosecutions difficult. Act provided precise definition and severe penalties. Previous law granted broad diplomatic immunity, protecting intelligence officers. Act eliminated immunity for espionage, making embassy cover less protective. Previous law didn't regulate foreign journalists, enabling spy cover. Act required registration, making journalist cover more difficult. Act faced criticism from Western governments and media, claiming it violated press freedom and diplomatic norms. I responded that press freedom didn't include freedom to spy and diplomatic norms didn't protect espionage. Act was defensive measure, protecting our sovereignty against intelligence operations that Western countries conducted routinely. If Western governments objected to Act, they should stop sending spies disguised as journalists and diplomats. 34 African countries adopted similar legislation by 2026, creating continental legal framework for prosecuting espionage. Harmonized laws enabled cooperation across borders and prevented operatives from exploiting different national laws. Western intelligence agencies faced consistent legal environment across Africa, making operations more risky and prosecutions more likely. We made counterintelligence a core government function, not an afterthought, through integrating it into decision-making and operations. Counterintelligence officers attended cabinet meetings providing security assessments. They reviewed contracts identifying foreign companies with intelligence connections. They vetted foreign advisors, preventing recruitment of government officials. They secured communications, protecting classified discussions. They briefed ministers on espionage threats specific to their portfolios. Integration transformed counterintelligence from isolated security function to central government capability. Ministers understood espionage threats and adjusted behavior accordingly. Officials recognized suspicious approaches and reported them. Government operations incorporated security measures protecting classified information. Counterintelligence became preventive rather than just reactive, stopping espionage before it succeeded rather than only investigating after damage occurred. We also educated African citizens about intelligence threats through public awareness campaigns reaching 45 million people. We taught people to recognize suspicious behavior, including foreigners asking unusual questions, offers of money for information, requests to photograph sensitive sites, and attempts to recruit government employees. We encouraged reporting of potential spies through hotlines and online systems, protecting reporters' anonymity. We built public awareness that security was everyone's responsibility, not just intelligence services' job. Education programs reached citizens through multiple channels. Schools taught students about espionage threats and reporting procedures. Television and radio broadcast public service announcements explaining what to watch for. Community meetings in villages and urban neighborhoods educated residents about intelligence threats. Posters in government offices, markets, and transportation hubs reminded people to report suspicious activity. Comprehensive approach ensured that awareness reached diverse populations across rural and urban areas. I personally launched Burkina Faso campaign in March 2025 through televised address explaining espionage threats. I described how Western spies operated using journalist, business, and diplomatic cover. I explained what suspicious behavior looked like, including unusual questions, photography of sensitive sites, and recruitment approaches. I provided phone number and website for reporting concerns, guaranteeing anonymity and protection from retaliation. I emphasized that protecting national security required citizen participation, not just government action. Response exceeded expectations. Within first month, hotline received 3,400 calls reporting suspicious activity. Most were false alarms reflecting heightened awareness rather than actual espionage. But 67 reports led to investigations identifying 8 foreign intelligence officers and 12 recruited agents. Public reporting provided intelligence that surveillance and technical methods couldn't generate. Citizens observed activities that intelligence services couldn't monitor continuously. The education programs reached 45 million Africans through schools, media, and community meetings across 34 countries implementing similar campaigns. People learned how spies operated, what to look for, and how to report concerns. The programs generated 67,000 tips that led to 340 arrests of foreign agents across continent. Public vigilance became a powerful counterintelligence tool that Western agencies couldn't counter because they couldn't operate secretly when entire populations watched for espionage. Western intelligence agencies struggled to adapt to mass surveillance by populations educated about espionage. Traditional cover stories that worked when populations were unaware became suspicious when people knew what to watch for. Journalists asking unusual questions about military facilities was reported by citizens who understood this was espionage indicator. Business person photographing infrastructure was reported by residents who recognized reconnaissance. Diplomat recruiting government employee was reported by official who understood recruitment approach. Mass awareness made espionage exponentially more difficult because operatives faced observation by millions of educated citizens. I am the architect of exposing Western espionage in Africa. I caught British spy James Mitchell filming classified military facilities with hidden cameras. I broadcast his crimes live to 50 million viewers across Africa. I extracted his confession on television where he admitted working for MI6. I revealed 47 other Western operatives he named. I implemented strict journalist registration, requiring background checks and equipment declarations. Mitchell's capture and confession became a foundational moment for African counterintelligence, demonstrating that Western spies were detectable and prosecutable. Broadcasting his confession to 50 million viewers destroyed myth that intelligence operatives were untouchable. Showing his hidden cameras and classified documents proved espionage was real, not paranoid fantasy. His naming of 47 other operatives enabled continental operation that degraded Western networks significantly. His prosecution and 18-year sentence demonstrated that espionage had consequences that diplomatic pressure couldn't prevent. I inspired 34 African countries to adopt similar security measures by 2026 through demonstrating that aggressive counterintelligence worked. Countries observed that Burkina Faso caught spies, prosecuted them successfully, and suffered no significant retaliation. Western governments protested but couldn't force us to release Mitchell or abandon security measures. Success proved that African countries could defend against espionage without fearing catastrophic consequences that Western powers threatened. Countries adopted measures including journalist registration systems implemented in 34 countries by 2026. Registration required background checks verifying journalists' credentials and employment. It required declaring equipment including cameras, recording devices, and communications gear. It enabled tracking foreign journalists' movements and activities. It created legal basis for prosecuting violations. Registration made journalist cover more difficult because operatives faced scrutiny that exposed inconsistencies in cover stories. I helped arrest 230 confirmed Western spies operating across Africa's 54 nations through sharing intelligence, coordinating operations, and providing technical assistance. Burkina Faso Intelligence Service shared information about Western operatives with counterparts in other countries. We coordinated arrests to prevent operatives from fleeing when colleagues were detained. We provided technical assistance including interrogation techniques, evidence analysis, and prosecution support. Continental cooperation multiplied effectiveness of individual national efforts. 230 arrests represented significant degradation of Western intelligence networks in Africa. CIA lost approximately 67 officers and agents. MI6 lost 45. DGSE lost 52. BND lost 34. Other services lost 32. Arrests eliminated years of network building, recruitment, and positioning. Replacing arrested operatives required time, resources, and risk because heightened African counterintelligence made new operations more dangerous. Western intelligence capabilities in Africa were substantially reduced for years following arrests. I invested $45 million creating Burkina Faso National News Network, employing 340 African journalists to provide alternative to Western media that served as intelligence cover. Network broadcast news, analysis, and cultural programming in French, English, and local languages. Network employed only African journalists after thorough background checks, verified no intelligence connections. Network provided platform for African perspectives without Western intelligence penetration. Network demonstrated that African countries could produce professional journalism without depending on Western media organizations that employed intelligence operatives. Network's success inspired similar initiatives in 23 countries, creating continental media infrastructure that reduced Western media presence and associated espionage opportunities. Independent African media was security measure as much as cultural achievement because it eliminated cover that Western intelligence agencies exploited. I increased our intelligence budget from $23 million to $89 million and hired 450 new officers, expanding capability to match expanded threats. Increased budget funded counterintelligence operations, technical equipment, training programs, and international cooperation. Additional officers enabled surveillance, investigations, analysis, and operations that small service couldn't conduct. Expansion transformed Burkina Faso intelligence from limited reactive capability to robust proactive service that detected and neutralized threats before they caused damage. Budget increase was justified through demonstrating intelligence value. Catching Mitchell and 47 operatives prevented intelligence losses worth far more than $89 million annual budget. Securing military communications prevented adversaries from learning our capabilities and plans. Protecting negotiating positions enabled securing better terms in international agreements. Intelligence was investment generating returns exceeding costs through protecting assets and enabling success. I helped create the African Intelligence Coordination Center connecting all 54 nations through establishing facility in Addis Ababa in 2025. Center enabled intelligence sharing, coordinated operations, and joint training. Center maintained database of known Western intelligence officers and recruited agents. Center coordinated arrests preventing operatives from fleeing between countries. Center provided secure communications enabling real-time coordination during operations. Center transformed African intelligence from 54 isolated services to coordinated continental capability. Information about Western operative in one country was immediately available to services in other countries where operative might travel. Operations could be coordinated across borders, preventing operatives from exploiting jurisdictional boundaries. Training and best practices were shared continuously, improving all services' capabilities. Coordination multiplied effectiveness of individual services, creating capability that Western agencies hadn't anticipated. I trained 12,000 counterintelligence officers across Africa through funding academy, contributing instructors, and hosting training programs. Training created professional cadre with standardized skills and shared methods. Trained officers caught 390 Western spies between 2024 and 2027, demonstrating training's effectiveness. Training was continuous, with new officers entering academy regularly and experienced officers receiving advanced training. Sustained training ensured that capability improved continuously rather than stagnating after initial success. I educated 45 million citizens about intelligence threats, generating 67,000 tips, leading to 340 arrests through campaigns that reached populations across 34 countries. Education transformed counterintelligence from exclusively government function to mass participation. Citizens became sensors detecting suspicious activity that intelligence services couldn't observe directly. Tips provided leads that investigations developed into cases. Mass participation created an environment where Western operatives faced observation wherever they went, making espionage exponentially more difficult. I achieved 85% encryption of government networks, protecting classified information from cyber espionage. Encryption prevented Western signals intelligence from intercepting government communications. Encrypted networks required cyber intrusion for access, which was more difficult and more detectable than passive interception. 85% encryption meant that most government communications were protected, though 15% remained vulnerable, requiring continued security improvements. I achieved 92% security of military communications through encrypted radios, secure phones, and protected networks. Military communication security was higher priority than general government communications because military information was more sensitive and more targeted by intelligence agencies. 92% security meant that military operations, capabilities, and plans were protected from interception. Remaining 8% vulnerability was primarily field communications that were harder to secure but represented a small portion of total communications. I improved African negotiating outcomes by 35%, military effectiveness by 45%, and diplomatic success by 50% through better information security. Negotiating outcomes improved because adversaries couldn't intercept our positions and strategies. Military effectiveness improved because adversaries couldn't learn our capabilities and plans. Diplomatic success improved because we could coordinate positions without foreign intelligence learning our approaches. Information security was force multiplier, enabling success across government functions. Negotiating outcomes improvement was measured through comparing agreements before and after implementing information security. Resource contracts renegotiated after security improvements achieved terms averaging 35% better than contracts negotiated when Western intelligence could intercept our positions. Improvement reflected negotiating from strength when adversaries didn't know our bottom lines, alternatives, and strategies. Information security was competitive advantage that generated measurable economic benefits. Military effectiveness improvement was measured through operations against terrorist groups and border security. After implementing communications security, military operations succeeded 45% more often because adversaries couldn't intercept plans and reposition forces. Ambushes were more successful because adversaries didn't receive warning. Defensive operations were more effective because adversaries couldn't learn our positions and capabilities. Information security directly improved military outcomes through preventing intelligence leakage. Diplomatic success improvement was measured through achieving objectives in international negotiations and organizations. After implementing information security, African countries achieved diplomatic objectives 50% more often because adversaries couldn't learn our strategies and coordinate opposition. Votes in international organizations went our way more often. Negotiations concluded with terms favoring our positions. Diplomatic coalitions held together better. Information security enabled diplomatic success through protecting strategies that adversaries had previously learned and countered. Your legacy is centuries of espionage operations penetrating African governments, militaries, and economies to enable your exploitation and control while hiding behind press freedom and diplomatic immunity. Western intelligence agencies. My legacy is exposing your spies, degrading your networks, building African counterintelligence, and achieving information sovereignty that protects our secrets and enables our success. Western intelligence agencies had operated in Africa since colonial era, conducting espionage that enabled exploitation and control. Colonial intelligence services gathered information enabling resource extraction, political manipulation, and military domination. Post-colonial intelligence continued same functions through recruiting African officials, intercepting communications, and conducting surveillance. Espionage enabled Western governments and corporations to exploit African resources, manipulate African politics, and control African development. Intelligence operations hid behind press freedom and diplomatic immunity that prevented prosecution. Spies used journalist cover claiming press freedom protections. Intelligence officers used diplomatic cover claiming immunity from local law. Covers enabled espionage while preventing accountability. African governments that attempted to prosecute spies faced protests about press freedom violations and diplomatic immunity breaches. Protections designed for legitimate purposes were exploited for espionage. My legacy is exposing spies through catching Mitchell and broadcasting his confession, demonstrating that Western operatives were detectable and prosecutable. Exposure destroyed secrecy that espionage required. Broadcasting Mitchell's confession to 50 million viewers made espionage public issue that populations understood and opposed. Exposure created political pressure for aggressive counterintelligence that governments had previously avoided fearing Western retaliation. My legacy is degrading networks through arresting 230 Western spies across 54 countries, eliminating years of recruitment and positioning. Degradation reduced Western intelligence capabilities substantially. Agencies that had operated freely faced arrests, prosecutions, and expulsions. Networks that had provided intelligence for decades were dismantled. Degradation forced Western agencies to reduce African operations because risks exceeded benefits when counterintelligence was aggressive and effective. My legacy is building African counterintelligence through training 12,000 officers, investing $45 million in capabilities, and creating Coordination Center. Building created continental capability that hadn't existed previously. Professional counterintelligence services detected and neutralized Western espionage. Coordination enabled continental operations that isolated services couldn't conduct. Building transformed Africa from intelligence target to intelligence-capable continent that defended against espionage. My legacy is achieving information sovereignty through encrypting networks, securing communications, and protecting secrets. Sovereignty meant that African governments controlled their information rather than having it intercepted by foreign intelligence. Sovereignty enabled negotiating from strength, conducting military operations securely, and pursuing diplomacy effectively. Sovereignty was foundation for comprehensive independence because countries that couldn't protect secrets couldn't fully control their destinies. History will remember which approach served Africa. The answer is written in Mitchell's televised confession watched by 50 million people, in 230 arrested Western spies, in 60% reduction of Western journalists who were actually operatives, in 85% encryption of our networks, in 35% better negotiating outcomes. You sent spies disguised as journalists. I caught them on camera and broadcast their crimes. You thought we were too naive to recognize espionage. I built counterintelligence that hunts your operatives. The lesson is eternal. The proof is spreading. The outcome is permanent. Mitchell's televised confession became an iconic moment proving that Western spies were vulnerable. 50 million viewers across Africa watched British intelligence officer admit espionage, name accomplices, and apologize for violating sovereignty. Confession destroyed myth that intelligence operatives were untouchable professionals who never got caught or confessed. Confession demonstrated that aggressive counterintelligence could expose and prosecute Western espionage despite diplomatic protests and media criticism. 230 arrested Western spies represented largest counterintelligence success in African history. Previous spy scandals involved individual operatives or small networks. This represented continental operation that dismantled networks across 54 countries. Arrests demonstrated that African counterintelligence had matured from reactive investigations to proactive operations that identified and neutralized threats systematically. 60% reduction of Western journalists who were actually operatives resulted from journalist registration systems and aggressive vetting. Registration exposed operatives who couldn't provide legitimate credentials. Vetting identified intelligence connections that disqualified applicants. Reduction meant that Western intelligence agencies lost cover that had enabled operations for decades. Remaining journalists faced scrutiny that made espionage more difficult, even if they were legitimate journalists without intelligence connections. 85% encryption of networks protected classified information from interception. Encryption prevented Western signals intelligence from reading government communications passively. Agencies that had monitored African government communications for decades suddenly faced encryption they couldn't break without cyber intrusion that was risky and detectable. Encryption transformed information security from theoretical goal to operational reality. 35% better negotiating outcomes proved that information security generated measurable benefits. Better outcomes resulted from adversaries not knowing our positions, strategies, and alternatives. Information security was competitive advantage that generated economic and political benefits exceeding security costs. Security was investment that paid returns through enabling success in negotiations, military operations, and diplomacy. Western intelligence agencies thought they could spy on Africa with impunity. You believed press credentials protected your operatives. You assumed Africans were too unsophisticated to detect espionage. You expected to gather intelligence freely while we remained transparent and vulnerable. You were catastrophically wrong. Your assumptions reflected arrogance and racism that underestimated African capability. You believed press credentials were absolute protection that African governments wouldn't challenge. You assumed African counterintelligence was incompetent and couldn't detect sophisticated operations. You expected that African governments would remain penetrated and vulnerable because we lacked capability to defend ourselves. Every assumption was wrong because you underestimated African determination to achieve sovereignty and capability to build institutions defending it. I caught your spy filming our secrets through surveillance detecting suspicious activity. I broadcast his crimes to the world through televising confession that 50 million people watched. I extracted his confession on live television through interrogation that broke his resistance. I arrested 230 of your operatives through continental operation that coordinated across 54 countries. I built counterintelligence that hunts your agents through training 12,000 officers and investing $45 million in capabilities. I encrypted our networks so you can't intercept our communications through implementing 85% encryption of government systems. I educated our people so they recognize and report your spies through campaigns reaching 45 million citizens. I achieved information sovereignty through protecting secrets that you had intercepted for decades. Each action demonstrated that African capability matched yours when we invested resources and applied determination. Encryption implementation was a systematic process requiring technical expertise, financial investment, and organizational commitment. I allocated $12 million from Burkina Faso budget for encryption infrastructure, including hardware, software, and training. We purchased encryption equipment from Chinese and Russian suppliers, offering technology without backdoors that Western equipment contained. We hired 23 cybersecurity specialists to implement encryption across government networks, train users, and maintain security. Implementation began with most sensitive systems, including military communications, intelligence networks, and presidential office. These systems received strongest encryption using 256-bit AES algorithms that were computationally infeasible to break. Military communications were encrypted end-to-end, preventing interception even if network infrastructure was compromised. Intelligence networks used separate encrypted channels isolated from general government networks. Presidential communications used dedicated encrypted devices that couldn't be compromised through malware or physical access. After securing highest priority systems, we expanded encryption to ministerial communications, diplomatic cables, and financial transactions. Each ministry received encrypted email systems, secure phones, and protected network access. Diplomatic communications with embassies used encrypted channels, preventing foreign intelligence from reading our instructions to diplomats. Financial systems were encrypted, protecting sensitive economic data from industrial espionage. By December 2025, 85% of government communications were encrypted. Remaining 15% were primarily public-facing systems and low-sensitivity communications that didn't justify encryption costs. The 85% threshold meant that classified information was protected while allowing efficient operations for non-sensitive functions. Western signals intelligence that had intercepted our communications for decades suddenly faced encryption they couldn't break without cyber intrusion, requiring sophisticated operations that were risky and often detectable. I educated our people so they recognize and report your spies through multi-year campaign that reached 45 million citizens across Burkina Faso and 33 other African countries. Education used multiple channels, ensuring that messages reached diverse populations. Television broadcasts reached urban audiences with higher media access. Radio programs reached rural populations where television was less common. School curricula taught students about espionage threats and civic duty to report suspicious activity. Community meetings in villages and neighborhoods provided face-to-face education and allowed questions. Educational content was designed to be practical and actionable. We didn't teach abstract concepts about intelligence threats. We taught specific behaviors indicating possible espionage, foreigners asking unusual questions about military facilities, government officials, or economic data, offers of money or gifts in exchange for information or access, requests to photograph sensitive sites or document restricted information, attempts to recruit government employees through blackmail or inducement, suspicious surveillance of officials or facilities. We provided clear reporting mechanisms that protected reporters' anonymity and safety. Hotline phone numbers were publicized widely and operated 24 hours daily. Online reporting systems allowed submitting tips through encrypted forms. Walk-in reporting was available at police stations and intelligence offices. Reporters could remain anonymous or provide contact information for follow-up. Protection from retaliation was guaranteed through law prohibiting punishment of good faith reporting, even if tips proved unfounded. Campaign reached 45 million citizens, generating 67,000 tips between 2024 and 2027. Most tips were false alarms reflecting heightened awareness rather than actual espionage. Tourist photographing landmarks was reported as suspicious reconnaissance. Business person asking about local economy was reported as intelligence gathering. Foreign student researching for academic project was reported as cover for espionage. False alarms were acceptable cost of mass awareness because they demonstrated that populations were vigilant and willing to report concerns. Among 67,000 tips, approximately 890 warranted investigation based on specific details and credible indicators. Investigations identified 340 cases involving actual foreign intelligence officers or recruited agents. Remaining investigations concluded that suspicious activity had innocent explanations. The 340 confirmed cases represented 0.5% of total tips, but 38% of investigated cases, demonstrating that screening process effectively identified legitimate concerns from false alarms. 340 arrests resulting from public tips proved that mass awareness was an effective counterintelligence tool. Western intelligence agencies that had operated with relative freedom suddenly faced populations watching for suspicious activity. Operatives couldn't conduct reconnaissance, recruit agents, or gather intelligence without risking detection by vigilant citizens. Mass awareness transformed counterintelligence from limited government function to continental capability involving millions of observers. I achieved information sovereignty through protecting secrets that you had intercepted for decades. Information sovereignty meant that African governments controlled their information rather than having it routinely accessed by foreign intelligence. Sovereignty was achieved through combination of encryption, preventing interception, counterintelligence, detecting penetration, and security culture protecting information through proper handling and awareness. Information sovereignty's value was demonstrated through improved outcomes in negotiations, military operations, and diplomacy. Negotiations achieved better results when adversaries couldn't intercept our positions and strategies. Military operations succeeded more often when adversaries couldn't learn our plans and capabilities. Diplomatic initiatives were more effective when adversaries couldn't coordinate opposition through advanced knowledge of our approaches. Information sovereignty was force multiplier enabling success across government functions. Each action demonstrated that African capability matched yours when we invested resources and applied determination. Western intelligence agencies had technological advantages, larger budgets, and more experience. But we had territorial advantage, population support, and determination to achieve sovereignty. When we invested in encryption, counterintelligence, and education, we created capabilities that neutralized Western advantages. When we applied determination to implement security systematically, we achieved results that Western agencies hadn't expected from African services they had underestimated. Your spy networks are broken through arrests that eliminated years of recruitment and positioning. Your journalist cover is burned through registration systems that expose operatives. Your intelligence advantage is gone through encryption and counterintelligence that neutralize your operations. Your operatives face prison through prosecutions that diplomatic protests can't prevent. Your agencies are blind in Africa through information security that prevents collection. Spy networks were broken through 230 arrests across 54 countries that dismantled networks built over decades. Each arrested operative represented years of recruitment, training, and positioning. Replacing arrested operatives required recruiting new agents, establishing new covers, and rebuilding networks. Process took years and faced heightened African counterintelligence, making new operations more dangerous. Western intelligence capabilities in Africa were substantially degraded for years following arrests. Network damage extended beyond arrested individuals. Each arrest compromised associated agents, safe houses, communication methods, and operational procedures. When operative was arrested, entire network connected to that operative became suspect. Agents recruited by arrested operative faced investigation. Safe houses used by operative were identified and monitored. Communication methods employed by operative were analyzed and countered. Operational procedures revealed through arrest were adapted against. Single arrest cascaded into comprehensive network compromise. Journalist cover was burned through registration systems implemented in 34 countries by 2026. Registration required background checks verifying credentials and employment. Checks revealed operatives using fabricated journalism backgrounds or working for publications that were intelligence fronts. Registration required declaring equipment including cameras, recording devices, and communications gear. Declarations revealed operatives carrying equipment inconsistent with journalism but consistent with espionage. Registration created legal framework for prosecuting violations, including operating without registration or providing false information. Burned cover forced Western intelligence to find alternative covers or reduce operations. Diplomatic cover remained available, but was more restrictive because diplomats' activities were limited and monitored. Business cover was possible, but required maintaining legitimate business operations that were expensive and time-consuming. Academic cover existed but faced scrutiny that exposed inconsistencies. No cover was as flexible and innocuous as journalism had been. Burning journalist cover significantly constrained Western intelligence operations. Intelligence advantage was gone through encryption, preventing interception, and counterintelligence detecting penetration. Western agencies had enjoyed information advantage through intercepting African government communications and penetrating African institutions with recruited agents. Advantage enabled them to know African positions in negotiations, plans in military operations, and strategies in diplomatic initiatives. Advantage allowed them to coordinate opposition, warn allies, and exploit vulnerabilities. Encryption eliminated interception advantage by protecting 85% of government communications. Counterintelligence eliminated penetration advantage by detecting and arresting recruited agents. Western agencies that had known African governments' internal deliberations suddenly faced information blackout. They couldn't intercept encrypted communications. They couldn't rely on recruited agents who were arrested or turned. They operated with incomplete information rather than comprehensive intelligence they had enjoyed previously. Operatives face prison through prosecutions that diplomatic protests can't prevent. Western governments protested arrests claiming violations of press freedom and diplomatic immunity. They demanded releases and threatened retaliation. But African governments maintained prosecutions, demonstrating that sovereignty meant enforcing our laws regardless of foreign pressure. Operatives were tried, convicted, and imprisoned. Diplomatic protests were ignored. Threats of retaliation were weathered through continental solidarity and alternative partnerships. Prosecutions sent clear message that espionage had consequences that Western governments couldn't prevent through diplomatic pressure. Message deterred some potential recruits who feared imprisonment. Message forced Western agencies to reduce operations because risks exceeded benefits when operatives faced real possibility of lengthy imprisonment. Prosecutions transformed espionage from low-risk activity to high-risk operation that agencies conducted more cautiously and less frequently. Agencies are blind in Africa through information security that prevents collection. Blindness was relative rather than absolute. Western intelligence still collected some information through satellite surveillance, open sources, and remaining agents. But they lost access to classified government communications, internal deliberations, and sensitive military information that had been routinely available through interception and penetration. Blindness meant operating with publicly available information rather than privileged intelligence. Blindness reduced Western intelligence value to policymakers and military commanders. Intelligence that couldn't provide insights beyond public information was less useful for decision-making. Policymakers who had relied on intercepted communications to understand African positions now faced uncertainty. Military commanders who had known African capabilities through penetrated sources now faced information gaps. Reduced intelligence value meant reduced budgets and reduced operations, as agencies struggled to justify African operations that no longer generated high-value intelligence. We have information security instead of your penetration through encryption, counterintelligence, and mass awareness. We have counterintelligence instead of your domination through trained officers, technical capabilities, and legal frameworks. We have encrypted networks instead of your interception through implementing 85% encryption of government communications. We have vigilant citizens instead of your safe operating environment through educating 45 million people about espionage threats. We have secrets instead of your transparency through protecting information that enables our success. Information security through encryption, counterintelligence, and mass awareness created layered defense that was difficult to penetrate. Encryption protected communications from interception. Counterintelligence detected and neutralized penetration attempts. Mass awareness created hostile environment where populations watched for suspicious activity. Layers reinforced each other, creating comprehensive security that was greater than sum of individual measures. Counterintelligence through trained officers, technical capabilities, and legal frameworks created professional services that detected and neutralized espionage systematically. 12,000 trained officers across 54 countries provided continental capability. Technical capabilities including surveillance detection, communication security, and cyber defense enabled identifying espionage. Legal frameworks including espionage laws, journalist registration, and prosecution procedures provided tools for aggressive counterintelligence. Professional counterintelligence transformed Africa from intelligence target to intelligence-capable continent. Encrypted networks through implementing 85% encryption of government communications protected classified information from interception. Protection meant that Western signals intelligence couldn't read our communications passively. Agencies that had monitored African government communications for decades faced encryption requiring cyber intrusion that was sophisticated, risky, and often detectable. Encryption transformed communications security from aspiration to operational reality. Vigilant citizens, through educating 45 million people about espionage threats, created mass surveillance that Western operatives couldn't evade. Populations that understood espionage indicators reported suspicious activity. Reports generated tips that investigations developed into cases. Mass surveillance meant that operatives faced observation wherever they operated. Safe operating environment that Western intelligence had enjoyed was replaced by hostile environment where populations actively watched for espionage. Secrets through protecting information that enables our success meant that African governments controlled their information rather than having it routinely accessed by foreign intelligence. Control enabled negotiating from strength, conducting military operations securely, and pursuing diplomacy effectively. Secrets were foundation for sovereignty because governments that couldn't protect information couldn't fully control their destinies.